listening to The Breakfast Show on Faith FM. This is the special Big Camp edition with myself, Lawson, and producer Shell here with me. Big Camp, by the way, is a big Christian camp, and we promoted that on the radio? I mean, we should invite more people to come. This is so good. I think that more people need to come. Maybe next year we can promote it more, so that people can come here and join us, because it's so nice. And you can hang out with,
and you can
Lawson
stay
and I,
Skafy's caravan
Michelle.
tent with him. Yeah, that's actually, that'll be a radio competition that you can win to stay. You can actually sleep in his bed.
Yeah, all right. Look, I'm not sure about that. Lawson does not have authority over my sleeping arrangements. But Lawson, I'm sure that you'll be offering that for yourself as well. I'm sure there's going to be
I don't work for Faith
a little space there between you and Shanna that I could accommodate someone else.
Yeah, dude. There's three in the bed, and the other one said, "Roll over." Okay. Bruce Shell is not liking this concept.
So you come, you bring your own tent. It's BYO tent, your own mattress. But you know what? We hang out. We definitely can hang out, and I would love to hear your story. Actually, just yesterday, I was just having a chat with a couple of friends here, and then someone came next to me and they said, "Hey, it just felt like I was listening to the radio." Oh. He was a friend that was a listener here. I'm just gonna give a shout out to Gordon and to David. They're listening to the Breakfast Show. They were here at Big Camp, and so it was great to hear their story and see how God was working in their lives. So next year around April, mark it in your calendar. Come here to the Big Camp, and we would love to see you around.
Absolutely. We would love to see you here, but we would also love if you can answer this quiz question. Please, producer Shell, what is our quiz question?
Our third quiz question of the morning. And I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing these names, but let's see how we go. So this is from 2 Samuel chapter 2. In verse 18, so get your head around where you are in the Bible.
Yep.
Okay. Zeruiah had 3 sons, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. Which one was as light of foot as a wild roe?
Oh, no. Sorry, hold on.
Okay.
Hold on.
So Lawson's familiar with the story, I think. Still not right.
Oh.
You are correct, Skafy, and you're obviously going to be correct now because you've gotten 2 out of the 3 wrong.
All those people are involved in the story where it's making that point, and I just picked.
Yeah, this is a very sad story, by the way.
Yeah, super sad.
In the Bible, very sad story.
Yeah. Let me read that out again. So, Zeruiah had 3 sons, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. Which one was as light of foot as a wild roe?
AKA, he was fast. He was lightning fast.
Yeah.
He was the good of his time.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Shout out.
Yeah, shout out to good.
It's Gout.
Gout.
Yeah, that's how it's pronounced.
Okay.
Gout. Yeah, shout out. Gout.
He's lightning fast.
Did you see the other day he did 19.6?
Yeah, in 200 meters.
It's like an Olympic level time.
I think it's a record.
So
what kind of record did he break?
It's second for under 20s. It's the second fastest. It's actually considered to be the fastest time ever because the first fastest time that for under 20s was done in like a competitive environment. It was like
really?
It was like they didn't have the provisions for anti-doping testing and
okay.
So, but Gout was faster. Like as an under 20, he was faster than Usain Bolt. He was faster than. So
wow,
we have the next sprinting sensation coming out of Australia.
Amazing. Can't wait to see him
Well, if you know
running.
who the fastest person in the Bible was, I think that we could fairly say that that's basically this character.
Yeah.
0491-064-669.
Yeah, that's right. Asahel, Abishai, or Joab. Send through your answer to 0491-064-669. And speaking of fast this morning, speaking of quick, speaking of lightning fast and beautiful as well. A really cool thing has happened recently in Honduras. Shout out to Honduras, a beautiful country in Central America. And they recently spotted a jaguar in the Honduras jungle that hasn't been seen for over 15 years, to the point where they thought that it had died and they would never see this type of jaguar ever again. In fact, it's called the cloud jaguar.
Oh, Yes, I've seen them before.
Yeah.
This is like a mutation in their is that, or this is a different species altogether?
So they live in a really high altitude space, and they have these really, really cool patterns on them. I'm showing Skafy now. They're like,
yeah, because so basically their spots are way bigger than normal, and it forms these cloudy shapes.
that's right.
Wow,
They're beautiful. They're like a beautiful, majestic animal.
man, jaguars are amazing.
Now, they hadn't seen them in like 15 years. They're thinking like, oh man,
We lost them. They're gone.
the
They thought that they were
cloud jaguars are-
extinct.
well, at least not in Honduras. Extinct in Honduras.
Yeah,
I'm not
wow.
sure. The article doesn't outline whether they are anywhere else. You can look that up for us. But yeah, look, essentially what the article says here is, high rates of deforestation and whatnot. It's causing these, really rare species of jaguar and that kind of thing to and other mountain lions and, cats, big cats, to go extinct, also hunting and poaching and these kinds of things. Now, this particular jaguar was captured on camera in Honduras's Sierra del Meridon. I'm just going to, pronounce it real Aussie for us all. The Sierra del Meridon, so that, mountain range there, for the first time in over 15 years. And it's also where they captured it. It's the highest elevation at which a jaguar has been documented in Honduras. So what we're seeing is actually, because of the threats to jaguars, they're moving further and further up the mountains. They're going further and further up in elevation to get away from them. And so, the images that they took, confirmed that they were in this mountain corridor of Sierra del Meridon. It's actually between Honduras and Guatemala. And, just beautiful animal. And, the researchers, when they they get their data back. Do you have a Ring doorbell? Actually, I got a Ring doorbell recently. Oh, there's a whole other story I haven't told on Faith FM, but my house got broken into and they stole my car, which is pretty wild. But as a result, I got a Ring doorbell because I didn't like that happened. And every time, someone comes to the door, I get like a notification on my phone and gives them a photo. So I can imagine, they wake up the next morning, these researchers, and they've got like a Ring doorbell prompt type of thing that's like, hey, there's someone that walked past this
A color
camera.
jaguar was spotted next to your camera.
Yeah, that's right. They would have seen the photos and been absolutely stoked. And they are. Now, the reason why, what they're attributing this to is multifaceted. Firstly, anti-poaching patrols have become more and more popular in South America. We know, Africa is famous for this, of course. The people stopping poaching over there. But in South and Central America now, they've increased their anti-poaching patrols. They use advanced monitoring technology. So, these ring-like cameras, probably like a lot better and cooler, but, these kinds of things, using AI integration and whatnot to spot certain things and to call it out, which helps the researchers a lot, Reintroduction of prey species. So this is another thing that's really interesting. Is that a lot of the prey species had become extinct because of hunting as well. Specifically in this case, which I thought was interesting, is iguanas. So jaguars actually...
Oh, they would eat iguanas?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, really?
Feeding on iguanas. Now, they had a steady supply of food before iguanas were beginning to get captured by people who wanted,
They should go to Florida.
Iguana skin. Yeah, there's lots of iguanas in Florida.
So, everywhere.
Well,
everywhere.
there's
If you go to
big-
Florida, if you go to the Miami area,
Yeah.
I have a brother that lives around that area in a city called Boca Raton.
Yeah.
Man, they're there by the thousands.
Now,
Everywhere. Massive iguanas, by the way.
Doesn't Miami have big cats in it? Aren't there big cats getting around? Not Miami specifically, but Florida, in forested areas and whatnot.
I don't know. Good question.
I think so. I should look that up because I think that's the case, and maybe they're out there eating all the iguanas.
But the thing is, the iguanas are in the cities, man. You don't want big cats. I think
Yeah.
I'd rather have a couple of iguanas, hanging out in my backyard,
Yeah.
than to have a bobcat or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what's really interesting about this, Honduras has one of the highest deforestation rates in Latin America. Making this find especially important, and so they can work with the government to say, hey, now that we know that these rare cats are, it's kind of one of those things in previous times where extinction of animal was less cared about, you deforest away. And if the animal's already extinct, then you can kind of continue to deforest.
Oh, well, no, here's the thing. I mean, there's no more reason for me to preserve and stop poaching down and destroying the forest.
That's right. But now that they have evidence of these sightings, they can effectively lobby to maintain these areas where these really rare and beautiful animals are, which I think is amazing. Look, I sit in a kind of balanced space of, using, the resources in the ground and using all these things, they can benefit us and da-da-da. But simultaneously, like, we need Gardens of Eden. And that's what I feel like God set up in originally. Like, he's like, hey, we've got this Garden of Eden that is this, like, beautiful playground of this habitat. Hey, everywhere else, like there was no dictate or anything that was preventing Adam and Eve to leave the Garden of Eden. I kind of see it as like their like training school, right? Like they're put in the Garden of Eden in this like perfect environment to learn how to like manage land and animals.
Yeah.
And then they can...
The tutorial.
The tutorial.
Yeah.
And then they can go outside of that and they can, they could, manipulate the world in the ways that they saw fit, into different things.
Yeah.
And I think we, as humans living in this world with dominion over this world, like we have a right, if we find iron ore in Western Australia in the middle of the desert, let's dig it up, man. Like let's do it. It's cool. It's helpful. It's awesome. But simultaneously we need these, I call them like these Garden of Edens, these sanctuaries where we can, maintain the amazing creation that God has made. And it's cool to see here that those efforts in Honduras are being bolstered because they're saying, hey, no, this is actually, this area of land is not only a beautiful forest, but it's harboring some of the most rarest and most beautiful of God's creations.
You're listening to the Breakfast Show podcast on Faith FM. Positively different.
I have a question that we're going to be exploring today. Should Australia make tobacco cheap again? Well, before we get into that, we're going to get into a quiz question. We actually have a guest here that we're going to be talking about this topic with, which is Lyle Southwell. Yes, he's here with us. Lyle, who used to be one of our original breakfast show pioneers here and hosts.
We had a request earlier this week to get the old team back together, and they specifically said Old and Lyle right beside each other. And so now we're here, the Double L team back in the studio.
Team Lyle and Lawson back in the team.
All right. Before we talk about cigarettes here, I'd like to ask producer Shell to give us the answer to the quiz question.
Indeed, I can do that. So our question was about who was as light of foot as a wild roe, and that was Asahel.
All right. Asahel. There you go.
So all of those names were involved. That's why I like...
They're all cousins of David.
Yeah.
And
they're all involved in that
men
story and they're chasing each other. And
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. So this is the story here, Lawson and Lyle. Back a couple of years, the Australian government, the federal government, would make $13 billion a year in tobacco revenues. Now that number has fallen sharply. Now it's sitting at around $5.5 billion. So this is, do the math revision. This is almost $8 billion loss of revenue. And one of the reasons, not that people are smoking less, but because people are smoking more illegal tobacco. And illegal tobacco has been causing a lot of dramas, a lot of problems. There's fire bombings in Sydney shops. There's gun violence attached to it. And people are trying to figure out, okay, how do we fight that? Do we fight that with more police, with more imports, fiscalization? But some people, actually, in particular, a Liberal senator from Tasmania, Senator Richard Kobach, he has been very vocal about advocating, saying, you know what, we should cut the taxes. We should cut the tobacco excise back in half.
Yeah.
Now, at the moment, the tobacco excise makes up for about 75% of the price of tobacco. So basically saying making tobacco 40% cheaper, effectively, he's saying. So what do you think about that one, Lyle? Do you think this is a good idea? Should we, because in this way he says, look, the criminality will disappear. We're going to have peace in the streets again. And the government is going to see a big increase in revenue.
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion and one that we can learn from when we look at history. And of course, the whole idea of taxing cigarettes very high is simply so that people can pay for their own death. There's a massive cost to the Australian economy from people who smoke, because then they die long, lingering deaths, and we have to pay for that. And so it's like, well, if you're going to do that to yourself, then you need to pay for your own death. And so the only way we can do that is to raise the excise. At the same time, it sends a very, very clear message out to the community. Don't do this. This is a really stupid thing to do. And along with that, of course, there are a lot of government and church-provided programs to help people get rid of smoking. So I think this is a good move. Now, what we can do is we can take a moment to look at this from history, because we've got examples from history. We can go back to Prohibition that took place in the United States. And when Prohibition happened in the United States, it was focused on alcohol. It wasn't focused on cigarettes, because cigarettes were not seen to be a health issue at that particular time.
They were a health product.
Yeah, they were a health product. They were considered to be a health product.
Yeah. If you're coughing, well, take some cigarettes. It should help.
Athletes were given cigarettes, Olympic athletes given cigarettes to stimulate their lungs.
Wow.
It was pretty crazy back then. But, the evidence of violence and so forth that came from alcohol was very easy to see, and so Prohibition came in. Prohibition lasted for a number of years, and then it was taken away because it gave rise to criminal gangs. It gave rise to your mobsters. You got some very famous Al Capone and so forth, very famous mobsters that made a lot of money out of that, and eventually ended up, serving a lot of time in prison as a result of that. And they're like, oh, the crime is too bad. There's too many people dying as a result of the crime, and so we need to get rid of Prohibition, which really, when it boiled down, all it was politicians who wanted to have access to alcohol.
Yeah.
Now, if we actually look at what happened, and you've got to be careful with history. This is one of the things you've got to be careful with history. And as somebody who's very keen on history, something that we always look at is the winners write the history. And so if we look at Prohibition, there are a number of effects that Prohibition had during its lifespan. So in the United States, under Prohibition, domestic abuse decreased by 82%.
Wow.
That's just massive.
Wow.
Drunkenness, obviously, decreased by 55.3%. Assault went down by 53.1%. That's people having a bit of a punch-up.
So general assault, not
General assault. Ordinary, what's called ordinary assault.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so not aggravated assault, but ordinary assault.
Sure.
Homelessness decreased by 52.8%. So if you want to deal with homelessness, here's a good way of dealing with it. Disorderly conduct went down by 51.5%. Juvenile delinquency decreased by 50%. Deaths due to cirrhosis of the liver went down by 50%. The number of inmates in jails and prisons decreased by 75%.
Wow.
And many correctional institutions were closed entirely during Prohibition as a result of that.
Wow.
General domestic complaints decreased by 2/3. That's people calling the police for a disturbance. What we've got here, country hospital death rates were historically low. Prostitution decreased. National crime rate, excluding Chicago, which was pretty legendary, declined by 38%. In Chicago, the crime rate declined by 25%. So even with Al Capone operating out of Chicago, crime went down overall by 25%.
Wow.
Now, the challenge is this, is that when you've got, significant mobsters who do significant crimes, they dominate the news cycle. It's just like mass shootings dominate the news cycle, but they're a minuscule percentage of, gun homicides that actually take place in the United States. But the only ones you ever hear about are the mass shootings.
Yeah, of course.
They're like 1% of, gun crimes and so forth. Anyway, savings accounts. This is interesting. Savings accounts tripled. Demand for services at welfare missions decreased by half. Insurance policies being written doubled. Real estate values increased dramatically due to home improvements that were taking place. Families became better clothed. Factory job attendance and job performance greatly increased.
Wow.
And so Prohibition was actually fantastic.
Probably one of
for
the
United
best
States.
policies.
Yeah, one of the best policies they've ever had.
seen.
But you will rarely read a history that looks at prohibition in the United States and focuses on anything other than the crime that was associated with it. Because, Al Capone, I keep throwing his name out, but there were many other significant mobsters during this time period that were involved in alcohol. There was tremendous government corruption. The police were involved. The politicians were involved. There was corruption all over the place because people wanted to get access to their alcohol during this time period. And that's what dominates the news. That's what dominates the movies and the TV shows that we see and the history that we see written. When you dig below the surface, it was actually the best thing the United States ever did. It was one of the most significant things that the US did to pull them out of the Depression.
Wow.
The Depression, this is Depression era, and without prohibition, America would have ran the risk of staying a lot longer in depression and would not have had the industrial might that they had come the Second World War. Because, industry is increasing, productivity is increasing, everything that is good about, society is increasing. And, the reason that the United States was so dominant in the Second World War is because of industry.
Yeah.
Once Japan attacked the United States, they awakened that bear that could not be put to sleep, and they just simply could not out-manufacture the United States.
I see in those patterns, and we're talking about the prohibition of alcohol, now we're talking about the almost prohibition of cigarettes, but they're very similar in nature. I see a cycle very similar to the book of Judges. Because in the book of Judges in the Bible, you have a cycle where the nation was okay with God and they had prosperity. That prosperity led them to forget about God and to engage in all kinds of horrible sins and apostasy. Then another nation, God would withdraw his protection from the people because basically they are driving God out of their life. Then a foreign nation would oppress them. They're going to be oppressed for many years. They're going to say, God, please help us, forgive us. We sin against you. God will send a judge. The judge will deliver them. They're going to come back to a place of peace and stability. And then the cycle continued on and on and on and on every time that has happened. I see that it's a similar thing. So we see that, let's say we have a drug. This drug is causing a lot of social issues. Then someone in the government says, hey, you know what? It's a good idea for us to prohibit that because we want to save our citizens from the nefarious effects of these drugs. And then they do it. And then the government starts losing revenue and crime increases. And they say, okay, because of crime, let us get these drugs back into place so we can also increase our revenue. And now the second state is not even a cycle. It stabilizes with the government being one of the major sponsors of that illicit substance, which was illicit before, and now it's legal because, there's so much money to be made. And, the alcohol and the tobacco lobbies are some of the most powerful lobbies in the United States. There's no reason for us to assume that they are not as powerful here in Australia. And one of the things that I'm so worried about is that, how young people were doing vaping? Now, young people, there's some research saying that the young people that were doing vaping are now going to back to cigarettes, actual cigarettes, because they're trying to quit vaping because vaping was so much worse for them because they're vaping all the time. And they say, at least cigarettes, we can have a break between one and the other. So that reduces my nicotine intake. So now when people thought that vaping were taking people away from cigarettes, actually it's bringing even a massive mob back into that. So look, I think that what do you think is the best answer to that? Is that any solution to that problem?
Total prohibition.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with total prohibition is that it removes the money that we need to be able to provide the medical care to those who work their way around prohibition. Mm-hmm. But it is still the best method that, historically, from a historical perspective, it is the best method that has ever been used. And, we see many movements in the opposite direction now, movements to legalize marijuana and, because it's arguably a better drug than alcohol. We do need to start with the drugs that are costing society the heaviest. Alcohol is top
number
of the list,
one,
and nicotine is certainly a very, very significant one. The reason that we go after nicotine is because it's socially acceptable to do so and politically expedient. Alcohol is far worse. Mm-hmm. That's where it should start. But if you try to do that, you're going to have all kinds of trouble because, politicians like their alcohol. Yeah. But, smoking has become...
winemakers as well are a big part of the economy.
So smoking has become something that, people in the lower socioeconomic sector of society participate in. And so that's why it's socially acceptable to to go after smoking.
Absolutely. And look, and of course, Jesus is the one who can actually fully deliver us from the power, the snare, and of these addictive substances. If you actually wanted to quit smoking, let us know here. Hashtag smoking to 0491 064669. We can send you some materials on that.
You're listening to the Breakfast Show podcast on Faith FM. Positively different.
It's now the time for our interview. Today, we have Brad Moody live with us. So not on the phone as we normally have. We get an opportunity to talk to him. And Brad is doing two things, actually. One of the things is that he is looking after a very special tent here at Big Camp. Can you tell us a little bit more about the tent that you're involved in? What's your role there, Brad?
Yeah, so we are working with the beginners, so the 0 to 2 years of age demographic, and they are just absolutely full of beans, as you can imagine. And so they're trying to get some of those beans out of them by the theme this week, which is Jumping Joeys. So the theme song is I'm going to jump for Jesus, and so all these little ones are bouncing up and down, and it's really
love
good.
It. That's awesome.
Get them up out of their seats and playing with all the furry animals.
If you can combine Jesus plus jumping plus a nice song, I mean, you have like a secret for success right there.
Absolutely. And it's really exciting to be amongst them. This is really the future of our church and of the Christian community. And so it's just really exciting to just get amongst it and see what God's doing through these people. One of the songs that they're singing every day is Galatians 6:10. I've memorized it and I'm grateful for it, which says, do good to everyone. And the song is all about that. They sing it every day. So we're getting them into some good scripture memorization as well, which is really exciting.
Amazing.
So, yeah,
wow.
It's been
That's
good.
Really cool.
Really enjoying it. And they've got some playtime up there, and the kids get amongst the little jumping castles, ball pits, and puzzles, and all the fun stuff. So it's
good.
Good.
It's
been
such
really
a
fun.
good time here in Big Camp. Like, it's a wonderful place for children to learn about Jesus and to have just like a beautiful time.
Absolutely.
Among their spiritual community. Yeah. So, Brett, now let's move from jumping Joeys to something a bit different now, a bit more serious here. Because I actually wanted to ask you when I saw you. I've been hearing a lot of Christian commentators. They're looking at the U.S.-Iran war, and they're saying that, hey, that this is the beginning of the horsemen of the apocalypse. So they say, look, the first horseman of the apocalypse is the Antichrist. It's coming up, and then there's one of the I think that the third horseman of the apocalypse is the one that's talking about famine. And they're linking now the looming crisis on fertilizers. There's many countries now that are really struggling. India being one of them, even Australia, because we often talk about that 20% of the of fuel goes through the Strait of Hormuz. There's 20% of oil, but also I think it's even larger proportion than that of fertilizers, oil-based fertilizers that the many industries rely on. It's also being disrupted. And they're saying, hey, if we're going to be seeing a widespread global wide famine, there's even some quote unquote prophets around online saying that they're predicting a massive famine to come upon the world. And they're all linking that back to the horsemen of Revelation. So I actually wanted to ask if you could guide us through where they're getting these ideas from, and are these the best way to interpret those scriptures?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Joseph. The horsemen of the apocalypse, so-called in Revelation chapter 6, it is a heavy-duty subject and prophecy. And although there might be some, a bit of a stretch, but some parallels with current events and things like that, we have to take Scripture in context. And we've talked about this numerous times in our apologetics section on Faith FM here, that we need to take Scripture in context. And in this particular scenario, it doesn't quite fit the primary reading of the text in Revelation chapter 6, talking of those four horsemen. You see, the book of Revelation is written not necessarily directly chronologically. It's more kind of giving a panoramic view of the great conflict between Christ and Satan. And in this particular chapter, we have a parallel to the seven churches of Revelation 2 and 3, and also the seven trumpets that are also talked about in the book of Revelation. And so we have these sevens, and we've talked about before the number 7 being a description of completeness or an entirety. And So what we're seeing here, coming from a historicist perspective of prophetic interpretation, is an elaboration of the same concept of the events that were, as it says in Revelation chapter 1 and in other places as well, the things which must shortly come to pass. In other words, these are the things that were happening from the time of the prophet himself down through history thereafter. And so when we're looking at the seven seals, which the four horsemen comprise part of, the first four of those, and we're looking at the seven churches, we're looking at a repetition and expansion rather than an entirely new concept. I'm not sure if that's resonating with you.
So from what I'm understanding here, what you're saying is that, look, when we look at the sevens in the book of Revelation, they start around at the time of Jesus' ascension to heaven, and then the last one is towards the second coming of Jesus.
The second coming of Jesus Christ.
They all have that theme,
That's right.
The seven churches, the seven seals, the seven trumpets.
Yeah.
But for a number of popular Christian interpreters today, they get all of that and just they take it in the future.
That's
and they're
right.
saying, okay, these are actually the sixth, or if there's seven seals, all of them are going to happen in succession, but right at the very end of time.
That's right.
So they're looking for something happening in the future. This is why, if you're coming from a historicist approach, which you're looking at the first rider, which is a rider on the white horse, and say, this is Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus is the one who had a crown, who went out conquering and to conquer. This is like the early church as well, sharing the gospel. But then for these dispensationalist method of interpretation, this is the Antichrist.
That's correct.
Oh wow, because they have to fit it towards the end of the world.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you raised there. And I wanted to clarify, as we've done before, the three major perspectives on prophetic interpretation, being the futurist versus the preterist and the historicist, and why we, as with the pioneers of the Protestant Reformation and many others likewise, believed the historicist perspective was the most rational and logical. So in Amos chapter 3 and verse 7, it says that surely God will do nothing except he reveals his secrets to his servants, the prophets. In other words, God is not going to do anything except as he reveals what he's going to do to his prophets, which means that at any point in time in the history of humanity, he has to have given some prophetic revelation to that demographic. And this is why the historicist perspective is the most rational, because the futurist and the preterist, the futurist, as you were just highlighting, a lot of evangelicals believe that the prophecies will be fulfilled into the future and that they have no real direct relevance to us or practical relevance to us in our day or to the people prior to us. And then the preterist is that everything has already been fulfilled, and we could talk
just
about
look at it as a historical
exactly right,
document.
but something that's happened in times past, and once again not directly relevant to us. But the historicist is the most rational in consistency with God's character as a God who is wanting to be involved with his people and says that he's not going to do anything except as he reveals it through his servants, the prophets. So he's going to give a prophetic word to every generation, and that's biblical. And this is why from the time of the prophet down through history, we should expect to see the revelations of these symbolic prophecies fulfilled, just as we did with Daniel. And you can see that same pattern throughout the book of Daniel and correlating with the book of Revelation. You've got Daniel 2 and you've got Daniel 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 as well, that follow the same pattern of repetition and expansion of the same narrative, the same picture, but with new details or particular focus points. And this is what you see in the book of Revelation as well. And so when we come to the four horsemen of Revelation chapter 6, we're honing in on that same time period from John's day, as we did with the seven churches, from his day down through to history. And you'll see this winding up with the second coming of Christ with the sixth and seventh seals in chapter 6. And some will perhaps argue that the context is this throne room scene in Revelation chapter 5 where the Lamb is being given the throne, and they say, well, see, this is end time. Obviously, the context tells us that we're talking about those events just prior to the second coming of Christ, and I would say yes to an extent, but the problem is that even in the context of those texts, when was it that the Lamb was given the right to sit on the throne and the right to open the seals? Well, that happened at his ascension.
At the ascension of
right?
Jesus, yeah.
And so this is once again, it's prefacing the Revelation chapter 6 exegesis into prophetic interpretation, being that they are reflections of the time period from the time that Jesus ascended right down through history thereafter until the time when Jesus comes back.
So let's have a look at the horsemen here. So the first one, and maybe we can look at from the historicist perspective, and which you're arguing here that is a better approach to read the book of Revelation, the proper approach, versus
rational,
the most rational approach versus the futurist approach. So the first one is we mentioned about the white horse. He sat on a horse, had a bow, and he went out conquering to conquer. The second one is a red horse that went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. So a lot of people are looking at that and say, hey, you see, it's war. And we're seeing like a war like we haven't seen in our generation, at least with the potential to be a incredible. This is
cataclysmic.
This is probably a more disruptive war than what we have seen in many generations in terms of the effects that it's having practically in cost of living in people's lives. Because if you come to think of it, this is even World War II, for example, it was a global war, but not all countries were involved in it. It was the major powers were involved in it. But for example, if you're in Brazil, the disruptions would be relatively minimal.
Small.
But now everybody across the globe are suffering severe consequences. So they're pointing, okay, this is the second horseman of the Revelation. What would be the historicist approach to that? The more rational version of it.
So the historicist generally, just by way of summary, would state that the white horse represents the apostolic church, and it's conquering and to conquer, as Colossians chapter 1 tells us, that the gospel was preached to every creature. It reached the then known world. And then from the white horse, which was successful, we have the red horse, which was given power to take peace from the earth, being the representation of the persecution, the imperial persecution of the Roman Empire against Christianity, and the bloodshed. And this would be correlative with the church of Smyrna in the churches that we were talking about, the 7 churches. So consistent with that. So then the third one, the third horse is the black horse, and he that sits on it has the pair of balances. And black being the opposite of white. You can see white as a symbol of purity all through scriptures, particularly in early chapters of Revelation. Black being the complete opposite of that, is the opposite of purity. It's the mingling of paganism, Christianity, where the whiteness, the purity of Christ's original doctrine is being amalgamated with paganism, and we are getting a distortion of the original beauty of the purity of Christ's doctrine, and that is represented by the black horse. This is basically the period from the 4th to the 6th century, and you'll see that it's talking there about a famine, and the historicists would suggest that this is correlated with Amos chapter 8 that talks about the famine, not so much of bread and of water and all of those sorts of things, but of the word of God. And you can see, especially there, it's mentioned that there is no power to hurt the oil or the wine. So how then can we talk about if it's an absolute famine, how can the oil and the wine still continue, but the rest of it be lacking?
Particularly because oil and wine were, as far as human crops are concerned, they are relatively luxurious items. They are like the superfluous. Like you don't need them to live as much as you need the barley.
That's right.
You can go without oil. Life's not going to be as fun.
That's right. But it's not going to be completely. That's
very interesting. So we're talking about here a famine, but the famine of the Word of God.
Exactly.
Which happened in the world during the Dark Ages.
Exactly.
For a massive period of time. The truths of God's word were occluded.
And this is where it sort of began, and then it faces the pale horse, which is the final one, with death being him that sat on it, and Hades or the grave following after him. And that is the period of the Thyatira and Sardis church. In between the Pergamos and Thyatira was the black horse, and now, like I said, pale horse representing that period from around 500 AD down through to 1500, the Thyatira and Sardis era, where there was was just an absolute blackout of spiritual life. Whereas just prior to that, there is the oil and the wine with the Puritans that carried the gospel into the wilderness regions effectively, that were out into, the Waldensian mountains and places like that. That representative of the oil and the wine, the oil just quickly representing the Holy Spirit, the wine being the true doctrine, as you can see as you study it out in Scripture. That's what those were symbolic of.
Amazing.
Now, we could continue on with this. I mean, there's so much wrapped up in this, but I wanted to just clarify, we're talking here about a spiritual warfare as Ephesians 6 talks about, that there is not a war between flesh and blood, but against spiritualities and principalities and powers in high places and wickedness. This is what this is talking about. It's the battle going on between the spiritual forces of good and evil, between Christ and Satan. It's not so much a literal battle, but at the same time, yes, there may be some, there's another approach that we didn't clarify with the futurist, preterist, and historicist perspective, and that's the idealist, which believes that it's entirely symbolic, and therefore relevant to every age, but it's entirely symbolic, and you can sort of read into it nuances and depths of understanding that are not necessarily...
They don't have a representation in the real world necessarily.
And that's right, but I would suggest to you that there is parallels, but that's not the primary reading of the text, and the primary reading of the text was to be relevant to us, yes, as we can look back through history and see it being fulfilled, but directly relevant to each period as it develops through the years.
That makes so much more sense. Thank you so much, Brad, for helping us to understand.
Thanks for being a part of the Faith FM family. Join our community on Facebook or get in touch at 1-800-FAITH-FM.